Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, we get to play around with some more alternate history scenarios. And the kings of that alternate history hub have 10 dumb ones to consider here. So let's just see how dumb they are. By the way, make sure you're keeping track of the channel. We've got more history showdowns coming up in the near future. That's my history trivia game show, starring your favorite history YouTubers. All right, this original video will be linked down below. Please support them. Let's check this out and I'll tell you what I think. All right, it'll be interesting to see what kind of considers dumb alternate scenarios. Are they ones that are just like completely implausible, or ones that only change things in some minor, I don't know, dumb way? Let's see.
As it turns out, there are a lot of dumb alternate history topics, or at least there are a lot more than 10. So since you all enjoyed the last time I did this, how about we talk about 10 more dumb alternate scenarios?
Yeah, check that one out.
Once again, we're gonna do this chronologically.
Okay. Carthage wins the Punic Wars.
Honestly, I get the appeal for this. You have two completely different worlds clashing with each other. As for the winner, they get to define the foundations of Europe for centuries to come.
They get Sicily. So yeah, what are, again, is it dumb because like the Carthaginians could never win?
But is that really the case? Hannibal is a 1 in a million general who combined elephants with the best military mind to ever take the battlefield. Yet Rome is a 1 in a million state.
Saying a lot.
Hannibal could defeat them. Hell, maybe even destroy Rome itself. But he could never beat them. The problem here isn't Hannibal, it's Carthage. This scenario poses two questions. The first being, could a military expedition, detached from supplies and reinforcements at home, take down Rome as an away team? The simple answer is no. The more impossible task, however, is the second question. A more impossible task is, could Carthage take Rome's place? And even more interesting, and even more definitive, no.
See, Carthage would have to, replicate Rome's geography, which they can't unless they somehow take over the entire empire and somehow rule it for themselves. You know, the Roman Empire is so resource rich with population, natural resources, all of those things that just don't exist there north of the Sahara.
What used to be a Phoenician colony was now a maritime city-state with a corrupted oligarchy set on becoming a mercantile superpower. The Punic Wars showed Carthage in its prime against a Rome which was filled with dreams and ambition. This was the extent of what Carthage could do, and they bottled a naval war against an enemy who couldn't even build a fleet. And once they did, they lost it to a storm twice. Carthage was a state that won 3 of the most decisive battles in antiquity, yet still lost the war. Making modifications in Italy or at Zama wouldn't alter the timeline in any significant way.
Now, maybe if Rome wasn't as powerful at that time, like Carthage had gotten bigger earlier and attacked Rome before, you know, the Rome that we think of, which even at this time in the Punic Wars was not nearly as large as it will be at its apex.
And even if it did, it would be inconceivable to imagine Rome losing. Rome just always had the population to bounce back. Carthage, which relied on mercenaries, didn't. Rome managed to come back every single time. And it just so happened to be that the way that Rome ruled Italy was much more stable for nation building than the way that Carthage did. Carthage could never pull off what Rome did. Not in the courts, not in the battlefield, or in the sea, or in the forum. Nor could Athens, Sparta, Syracuse, or Pella.
Well, like, if they went in and then adopted all of those institutions, then yeah, I guess so. You know what I mean? They tried to rule over them. You know, like the Greeks, the Romans, come into Greece and then leave a lot of those institutions in Greece, especially like the scientific ones. Okay, because that does happen sometimes. They go in and just kind of take over the pre-existing institutions. So like the Mongol Empire did that, although they collapse.
Carthage was not Rome, and it never would be.
Okay.
It's funny
Justinian
that
reunites
one of the
Rome.
most...
Okay. This is an interesting one. That was kind of his goal. So he, again, a good century or so after West Rome falls, Emperor Justinian out east reclaims like the Italian peninsula, but not like Gaul, Spain, that kind of thing.
Amazing scenarios revolving around Justinian. The most popular one, in fact, just happens to be one of the dumbest. Seriously, you got stuff like, what if the Black Death killed him or was postponed? What if Theodora didn't save him during the Nika riots or convinced him to focus on the East? There is so much potential here. But nah, let's do a cookie cutter impossible to achieve Roman reunification run. Why not? To be fair, Justinian had the administrative and military capabilities to get the job done. Additionally, if the reunion was to happen, this was the time to do it.
Is that for certain?
It had only been a half a century since the fall of the West. So let's relegate this
by the end of like Romanus Augustus, the final emperor,
a half a century since the fall.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, they were. By the time that had happened, Rome was a shadow of its former self.
The West.
Shell of its
former
self.
So let's relegate this from being an actual dumb scenario to a slightly improbable one, on account of the fact that.
What was that scale you're using?
Sorry, Roma Booze. Had you going there for a second, but now it's time to shatter your dreams. What? The Latin-speaking West, which had nowhere near the resources the East possessed, was in an abysmal state.
It's a huge reason why they fell and why the East survived. The East had been carrying the West already, even before like splitting it up with Diocletian and administrative districts. Yeah, the East, it's by the trade routes. Again, it's resource rich.
How defiant the Vandals and Ostrogoths were, you can pretty much take out the RE and call it for what it was, a conquest. The church divisions were already apparent. And even if Justinian didn't have an incredibly competent enemy,
are you guys of the mind, kind of like I am, that once Constantine moved the capital to the East, it was kind of, the West was done.
To the east, his hold over Italy and Spain and didn't have an incredibly competent enemy to the east. His hold over Italy and Spain would be short-lived. And then there's the disasters. A year before he ascended the throne, the Byzantines were struck by arguably the worst earthquake in human history. The 526 Antioch earthquake wiped out 80% of the empire's third largest city. Wiped it off the map. Alongside 250,000 people. That's over 1% of the entire empire's population.
And then I guess it does kind of come back and then gets massively sieged in the First Crusade.
Just 2 years later, another but milder earthquake destroyed what was left standing alongside the buildings under construction.
By the way, that's not too far from the Turkish earthquake that happened. Was that 2 years ago now? That was super devastating. Right there, kind of on the eastern, bend there of the Mediterranean.
Destroyed what was left standing alongside the buildings under construction. The Nika riot fires engulfed Constantinople, destroying much of it, including the church, upon which Justinian later built Hagia Sophia. In 536, the eruption he like remodeled it. Constantine had it built, but the version that you see now is, again, largely the Justinian version. One of my favorite buildings in the world, probably top 3. The Krakatoa volcano impacted the entire world, causing severe famine throughout the empire. If we stop here, you can easily call this one of the unluckiest reigns ever, but just when you think it's over, bam, the plague. The bubonic plague lasted from 541 to 549 and coincided with yet another earthquake, this time in Constantinople, wiping out 25 to 50% of the empire's 25 million population. This was a disaster that the Byzantines didn't recover from for centuries. So yeah, Justinian was truly S tier for coming out on top of this, despite having a bad draw.
That's true, but thinking about that. I never really thought about his reign with the obstacles that he had of these natural physical disasters. The riots, that's one thing, but
charge at the worst time. To create a timeline where Justinian achieves his dream, we would have to reverse plagues, earthquakes, centuries of cultural differences, pacify an enemy, and break the very rules of biology just for the Byzantines to take back Rome.
It's the fate of all the trade kingdoms. If you do long distance trade like this and you got Silk Road travel, you are going to have pandemics. It's the thing that happens. The more connected we are, the more disease spreads, because diseases form in certain places on the planet. And the further away you are from the sort of genesis of that disease, the more deadly it's going to be for you biologically.
Sorry.
The double-edged sword of...
So I made a mistake.
Connection.
The mistake of talking about World War II on YouTube.
Yep.
A great sin.
Don't do it.
One that the YouTube gods punished me dearly for.
Don't do
oh
it.
boy, a YouTuber complaining about demonetization. Well. What else is new?
So I was thinking there because, yeah, it's hard to say I talk about anything World War II related without getting demonetized because so many people have ruined it for us. I thought he was just going to say from the World War II know-it-alls. That could be annoying in comments and things.
Punished for wanting to talk about World War II on a history channel. And I still want to talk about World War II or any other topic regardless of what YouTube says. So that's where Patreon comes in. By joining the Patreon, you get access to monthly exclusive videos whose topic is voted by you. Stuff that might never see the light of day on YouTube.
Everyone's getting
over the last year, in fact, we've built up a catalog of exclusive videos that you've never heard of. Britain and France declare war on the Russian Empire. Germany, who is allied with the Russians, declares war back.
Wait. Let me go back. Okay, so Bismarck, what if Bismarck died? Okay.
Videos that you've never heard of. Britain and France declare war on the Russian Empire. Germany, who is allied with the Russians, declares war back. Austro-Hungary declares war on Germany, and in response, Italy declares war on the Habsburgs. The Patreon's been going on for a little bit, and I thank everyone who has contributed. Alright, self-sponsor.
Oh, is that a video on Patreon? Oh, okay. Vikings colonize... Oh! School!
Vikings in America, discovering North America centuries before Columbus. You know, by accident. What if they just stayed? Could we have seen an alternate colonization of North America, but with Scandinavians instead? Well,
if they had gone further south, let's say, like really invested going south.
Well, you see, there are a lot of differences between the Vikings finding America and the Spanish. Yeah. The conquistadors were backed by a centralized state, willing to invest in these new lands. The Vikings essentially stumbled upon Newfoundland, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly overflowing with gold. Even for future Europeans who wielded far superior technology than the Norse, colonization wasn't easy. Plus, the very way the Vikings interacted with Newfoundland, or Vinland as they called it, was far different than future colonists. This was not a settlement for expanding influence. It was kind of a gathering point for resources. The barest of resources: wood, beaver pelts, and grapes. For the Norse, settlements weren't always seen as permanent endeavors. They could always be temporary, another stopping point on the sea, and if it just wasn't in the cards, they would simply leave. They weren't gonna live and die for the sake of holding some land like future European settlers would.
The Vikings, they love to raid, man. They like to come in, they take your stuff that you worked on, and then bail.
Plus, it's important to remember that the Norse were particularly vulnerable to being absorbed by local populations, as seen in England, Normandy, and Sicily. With resistance from the locals, scarce food supplies, and distance from Europe, the Viking settlement would have been doomed from the start. Vinland would likely never have grown large enough to serve as a stepping stone for future colonies, even if the Vikings actually did want to stay there.
I don't know. I mean, well... Yeah, I mean, how they went about it. Again, it wasn't like a big, like he was comparing it with, say, the voyages after Columbus. Okay, so remember the big thing that allowed the Spanish to have that success was just the whole ticking time bomb of disease that came out and wiped out 90% of indigenous peoples there in much more resource-rich places. Up in the north there, like, because you're talking northern Canada, you're not going to have that kind of self-sufficiency. It would have taken a lot of it, but those nations, these Viking nations, they don't have the resources, the wealth, and things that you're going to have in 500 years from, say, the Spanish or later the Portuguese, English, French, etc. So, but it doesn't mean there couldn't have been like long-term settlements, though. You know what I mean? Just not something that would mimic the Spanish empires of the West. All right, the Medici unify Italy. Okay. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they do through the papacy, through the Medici popes there, but it's what I never really thought of.
The cradle of Roman law, seat of the papacy, home to Da Vinci, Galileo, and of course, pizza, or at least what they call pizza. Hey, why not add nationalism to the list? After all, Machiavelli's The Prince became foundational to the study of political science and realpolitik. Aren't the Italian cities a form of mini-states in themselves?
Yes.
Venice was able to play ball with the big boys, even taking one of them out, while the Medici founded a large part of what we consider culturally the Renaissance.
Right.
Yeah, the Medici were
pretty
powerful.
much responsible
They
for
held
it.
Florence in the palm of their hand, and they turned it...
Yeah, no Medici's, especially the art scene, when it comes to creating an environment where people like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo could Florence. And I guess the political ramifications of like Machiavelli, I guess. I mean, he was talking about the Borgias and their brutality, but as an effective way of using this brutality to take power
into an incredibly strong state. So why couldn't Florence have been the one to unite Italy instead of Savoy centuries later? Well, here's the thing. Nobody could have brought all these flavors into one dish. Not even Lorenzo the Magnificent. They had to be forced together by a future Corsican general.
I was waiting for this. I mean, the modern nationalism of Europe draws its roots in the countering of Napoleon Bonaparte and the nationalism that he brought into France there. Yeah, there's no need for nationalism. There's no, you know what I mean? This wasn't that time period of these massive mega states. And the Italian city-states were so profitable. I mean, like Florence with the Medici family. Medici family were probably the richest people in Europe. They could finance anything, and usually did, because that was like their big thing at that time, was going to be banking. I mean, basically, if back in those days, if the church needed money, you borrowed from the Medicis,
who had a deep desire to redraw borders. Prior to the Italian republics, it was the cities, hell, neighborhoods, that formed a unique identity, one which trickled into Europe over the course of centuries. This was the only place in Europe which had rejected autocratic dynasties and papal theocracy.
Think about ancient Greece, by the way, because that's a good comparison you have of the city-states. Remember, Greece only unified in times of crisis that there would be a common threat, say like a Persia. Otherwise, there was no need to, especially when you had a balance of power like you had in a lot of these Italian city-states.
Forging an intense level of local cultural identity. It came in many forms, but none of which we'd call Italian. Every city had distinct dialects, which others didn't comprehend, something which remains true in many places to this day. Different customs, style of government, ideologies with strong influences from the French, Spanish, Austrian, and even Arabic world.
You know, if the timelines had matched up a little bit better, where you're going to get the age of absolutism, where cities, or sorry, not cities, but like nation states, really kind of forming the way that they are with absolute rulers, say like with Louis XIV and the power that came from there, or Russia's absolute rule. Remember with like Peter the Great and onward. Remember these like didn't really happen till like say the 1600s, and then also getting in maybe even to the 1700s. When you're talking about like the Medici era, when you're talking about later 1500s, it's kind of like the time periods don't overlap enough of this age of absolutism, which definitely could have brought nationalism, because they did. And that was the goal of some of these absolute rulers, as they were consolidating power. So maybe if the Medicis were like, at least at their height, when you're talking about Lorenzo, maybe 100 years later, I think you could maybe have this discussion. What do you think about that of Italian unification?
While Venetian, Milanese, Florentine, Pisan, and Sienese were the very first clear identities in Europe, ironically, the Italian unification was the last and most difficult compared to the rest. While other European countries also have several regional dialects, Italy, despite being about the same size, has 30 to 40, more than the rest combined. Long story short, even to this day, Italy is still divided. It certainly wouldn't have been unified in the 15th century.
Yeah. Gunpowder Plot succeeds. Okay, what's he talking about with gunpowder here? What specifically?
So fun fact, many of you actually voted for this scenario. That prompted me to sit down and dig into the event that most people only know about because of that dumb mask. But did you know that dumb mask almost committed the biggest terrorist attack in human history? I forgot what that was called. Potentially. I mean, it didn't happen, so we don't really know, but it could have been a lot bigger than you probably thought. Remember the 5th of November indeed. It seemed like a great scenario to explore at first, but once you dig deeper, you see, Guy Fawkes, the cartoonish villain the British monarch he forever curses the name of, wasn't even the ringleader of the plot, a plot which failed due to a simple delay. So what if that gunpowder plot had succeeded? What if the plan went off without a hitch? Well, the plan was to stack 36 barrels of gunpowder beneath the British Parliament and blow it up as the king and his family were visiting. Do you know how big of an explosion 36 barrels of gunpowder can make? I do. Like, if this actually happened, it would have been like that one scene from Game of Thrones, but probably bigger. Parliament itself would be obliterated, taking the lives of King James I, his son Prince Henry, every member of the House of Lords, many from the House of Commons, even high-ranking bishops, plus potentially anything in a 2-block radius, all annihilated. This is like taking out the White House, Congress, and Supreme Court at the same time. Sounds like an event that would have major repercussions. Yeah, you'd think. The goal of the plot was to revert England back to Catholicism, and oftentimes that's kind of the overall idea for this alternate scenario. Like, destroying the government would somehow install a Catholic monarch back into power. But here's the thing, after the brutally repressive reign of Elizabeth, that ship had already sailed. Barely anyone showed support for the plot, even British Catholics. This was a group of men who wanted to commit a terrorist attack and had no follow-up. They had no plan, no backing. The only hope was that once the attack actually happened, the country would rally behind them. But I don't think that rally would ever come. Even the failed plot led to...
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Cody saying here, though, but... yeah, that's not going to get your point across. It might really disrupt things. I guess maybe that could happen if you just want to create chaos and then create something out of that chaos. But I don't know, gain all the sympathy? I don't know about that.
Massive wave of anti-Catholic reprisals. So really no change here. The biggest change is really the death of James I, but he would have been succeeded by another one of his many sons, while the House of Lords would have just been filled up with newly selected members. London would rebuild, like it did many times before.
Yeah,
I mean, this isn't even close to the greatest disasters London's ever had. This ain't no Great Fire of 1666. Restoring its seat of government would be no big deal. Does the plot make England Catholic? No. Does it alter its place in the world or its standing with other nations? Not at all. Revolutions often begin with big bangs, but they need a follow-up too. They need support from within either the upper or lower classes.
That's what I was kind of saying, like he flashed Napoleon there, like the chaos that ensued from the French Revolution created that vacuum that Napoleon was able to fill. So that's what would have to happen there. It would have to be a completely chaotic situation. You got to understand with Napoleon, you're talking that there was like a decade of instability in France. And I don't know if England would have that. I mean, a decade of it after like a terrorist attack? Probably not. Is this a thing that people like are arguing though about him?
And this would have neither.
About the gunpowder plot.
Let's do a 180. Let's talk about a scenario which attempts to prevent an unstoppable force by removing one small bang.
What? Franz Ferdinand survives and there's no Great War. Yeah, I'm the one of, you know, the war was already said. The whole powder keg theory of all the ingredients for World War were there. It just needed a spark. And if it wasn't going to be this one, could it be another spark? You know what I mean? And there could have easily even been one in Bosnia again, or just with Serbia.
So Franz Ferdinand's driver doesn't get lost in Sarajevo, and the Archduke never gets assassinated. What comes next? The progressive Ferdinand would most likely inherit the throne 2 years later, and institute much-needed reform, granting autonomy to the minority groups in Austro-Hungary. But even if he was to do that, and his military cabinet just ran with it, does that undo the humiliation of the Russo-Japanese War, the one that made the Tsar super ambitious? Do the relations between Britain and Germany smooth over after the Boer War? How about the Moroccan crisis of 1905 and 1911, which isolated Germany and united the British and French? Or the Italo-Turkish War of 1911, which saw the Ottomans lose Libya? The balance of power was quickly fading. Russia and the Ottomans were on the brink of revolution. Germany was feeling that its win streak was starting to fade, and Britain was concerned about its empire. Italy had so much to prove. In the late 1800s, alliances were in constant flux. But since Bismarck left office, they were starting to take firm shape.
And when Bismarck was telling, was it Wilhelm, right, that like, get out of the Balkans, and he was just like, yeah, right, watch this.
Every war cabinet in Europe wanted war.
Sorry, I'm still sick.
Above all else, you can't really ignore the two Balkan Wars, representing the biggest shift in the status quo in Europe since 1871. Not to mention, Europe was being hit by the biggest wave of anarchist movements, which claimed numerous heads of state. The arms race was on, and everyone wanted to give industrialized warfare a try.
Could I give an alternate scenario potentially, though? Let's say that the assassination of the Archduke doesn't happen. You have some other event, and I don't know when that would be, but let's say it's even like a few years out. Does that also change, not the fact that there's going to be a World War I, a World War II, like the timelines? Let's say Mr. Mustache Man. What if his timeline ended up being one that didn't really go into him being involved in the way that he was in World War I with those motivations? And again, the timeline that he had. And then after the war, getting involved into kind of politics by accident and how the war ends, all of those sort of things. Like World War I could happen, but maybe the outcomes of the war could change a bit. And that timeline actually has a bigger effect on the distant future rather than like the near future. Again, if the timeline messes up the rise of Mussolini or again, the rise of Adolf Hitler, like what if those timelines get messed up? What if the timeline also that brought in that of World War I also adjusted what is going to happen with the Russian Revolution? Could that have changed things? You know what I mean? So it's almost like the timeline of World War I, if that had shifted by a few years, what would it have done to those massive events? Like the three I just said. What do you think about that?
Because everyone, and I do mean everyone in Europe, either felt that this was their chance to climb the ladder or preserve their place on top. It's a great point of divergence, just not one that prevents World War I. For that, you have to look further back. I actually did a video on what if Bismarck was assassinated in 1866, and that one just throws everything into chaos.
All right, no Pearl Harbor. So is the dumb alternate scenario that like it was unavoidable, like completely? It was very, very unavoidable. It's not an unmovable object like World War I was. Let's see what his framing is.
So yeah, oil, the black gold, the thing every major power ran on. It was not evenly distributed across the world. No. In 1940, the United States produced more oil than the rest of the world combined, sitting at 180 million tons.
Japan
Next came Venezuela, and then the Soviet Union. Then Indonesia, Iran, Mexico, and Romania. Germany used a very costly process converting coal into synthetic oil, which was less efficient, and it caused their deep desire for the Caucasus. The Japanese, though, had all of their eggs in the American basket. Right. If you think about it, this means that the Sino-Japanese war effort ran on American oil. Every bomber, every ship depended on this oil trade. Hirohito had 6 months of oil in stock, so when America hit Japan with an embargo in June 1941, wouldn't you know it, Japan hit America in Pearl Harbor that December.
During the diplomatic negotiations to potentially end the embargo. That's where the military and the whole political scene were very much not in unison there in Japan.
There is no conceivable reality where Japan does not attack everything in the Pacific after the embargo. The timing of the embargo could be moved a bit, but the attack on British Malay for the rubber, Dutch East Indies for the oil, and America for naval dominance is guaranteed.
Philippines for sure.
Now, what you could do to change things a little...
Yeah, but the thing is, if they had attacked something even a little bit more closely related to the United States, maybe wouldn't have had the emotional response they had of Pearl Harbor, which was seen as like a direct attack on the United States. But what about like the Philippines, which was one of the goals there, which was an American colony? You might have something similar as well, bringing in the United States.
bit is have Lexington and Enterprise present for the attack or blow up the fuel tanks. But so what? The war is prolonged. Some ships from the Atlantic are moved to the Pacific. How that theater unfolds would be exactly the same. Japan's disorganized army structure and overextended economy could never compete with American production. Nobody could. America's plan for invading Japan would not be enacted for the exact same reason as in our timeline.
See, I'm still though that I'm not 100% convinced that the United States would have joined though. Again, the emotional response to Pearl Harbor was so big. So if it's some of these other possessions that aren't even necessarily American, although they were kind of American adjacent when you had like the French who were an ally and their territories like being attacked. Again, the Philippines would probably be a different story. So I think it does kind of largely depend on what Japan would be attacking.
While we're at it, as inevitable as the embargo and Japanese hostility is, the war against Germany is just as inevitable.
Okay. All right. Okay, Soviet Union survives the August coup. Okay, here we go.
So, you got a group of hardline communist leaders attempting to seize the Soviet government, who managed to place Gorbachev under house arrest and declare martial law. But 3 days later, the plotters failed, and just 3 months later, the Union was dissolved.
It was already
cooked. So in this alternate scenario, have the coup succeed and...
Especially post-Glasnost and Perestroika. You still had the failures of the Soviet-Afghan war, the PR and logistical disaster of like Chernobyl. You still have those going on. So if we're going all the way up to like the August coup, yeah, that's not going to happen.
All is well, right? The Soviet Union is saved. Here's the thing. While the Soviet Union might have been preserved, this was not the event or time to do it. 2 years earlier, Berlin had fallen. The Soviets were humiliated in Afghanistan. They lost the space race. They needed American grain to feed their people. And
do you think maybe though maybe they could have survived on a little bit more, but they would lose all their all their satellite states. They would lose all them, and it would just essentially be Russia under this communist regime.
They lost the space race. They needed American grain to feed their people, and many republics were ready to go to war if it broke out. Most importantly, the Russian leader Boris Yeltsin stood firmly against the coup. The Russian people marched out in mass protests against them. Even the military was against this move. Imagine your whole house is burning down, and you decide to go in, hoping to save it by frantically blowing on the flames with your mouth. You stand there, cheeks puffed out, sweating profusely, yelling, "Don't worry, I got this," as the flames grow higher. That's what the scenario feels like. Making alterations to Lenin's succession, Khrushchev's reforms, Brezhnev's...
Those Lenin pictures always look so scary. I mean, he had those strokes. He was already just fried, but... And then it doesn't help when you got Brezhnev's freaking eyebrows. Gross.
Stagnation, the Sino-Soviet split, the Afghan invasion, Chernobyl, hell, even the space race could probably have led to an interesting scenario where the Soviets' lifespan is extended, but this ain't it. Frankly, we most likely live in a timeline which saw a prolonged, limping Soviet Union collapsing on its last leg. Despite all of its natural reserves, it ran out of gas a long time ago.
That coup was the last, it was like the last absolutely desperate thing to try to do something from the Communist Party. I mean, it was literally the last round in the chamber when there are a lot more enemies that you can deal with that. It's like, well, what's the point? Just so you can say you went down swinging, I guess, instead of striking out looking. All right, X-Empire never falls. Oh, great.
So these last two are less scenarios and more of just templates, topics that I've done many times. I am guilty of this, and I'll keep doing it. Try to stop me. There's nothing wrong about thinking about if X Empire never fell. It's a classic hypothetical. Yes. It's also not really plausible at all. Imagine every change you would need to keep the Roman Empire afloat.
Not the fall, it can also
Let's say everything just goes perfectly for Rome. All the issues that compounded just go away, or they aren't as bad. That's great, that's perfect, but it also makes things very difficult to predict, because what is Roman history if not just documenting the problems that unfolded upon Rome? The issues Rome faced is what shaped Rome. So to imagine a world where it all goes perfectly is entertaining, but it can't really be considered plausible. It's basically fan fiction, the equivalent of a kid just going, I have no weaknesses, I win, which isn't how any empire or nation works, because empires have enemies, other kids playing the game too, and each player responds to the actions of every other player. If you have one empire just be perfect, it just snowballs the entire scenario, changes the world in ways that no one can predict. I wouldn't wish having to imagine this scenario on anyone. To keep track of all the players on the map and how they'd change if an empire didn't fall or if things stayed the same? Oh god. I guess what I'm getting at here is that if, say, Rome never fell, we would not have a world that looked like this. A stereotypical, classical Rome, one stuck in time. We would have a Rome that would be entirely alien to us. Rome itself changed drastically from the ancient days of the Republic to its final end in Constantinople. What it even would be entirely depends on the challenges it faced.
I think we see a rate of change in the modern world that is so drastic and fast that it makes a change from the beginning of the Roman Empire to the end of the Roman Empire seem like nothing ever took place.
Hell, even the typical Roman soldier we imagine changed in appearance. When Rome fell, the average Roman soldier didn't look like this at all. He looked like this, something closer to what we imagine as a medieval foot soldier.
Right.
So even if we imagine a world where Rome just continued on, what Rome would even look like or act like would be completely alien, because we don't know how that empire's history would have been.
I mean, how different could it have been? I mean, can we hypothesize, though, like a little bit? Like, what are we talking about? Are we saying maybe an industrial revolution takes place early, and then we're just on a quicker path towards the modern technology we have now, but maybe happening centuries ago? That would just be one that would come to my mind.
Imagine if America collapsed after the end of the revolution. Not reclaimed by Britain, but it just kind of disappeared or something. In some alternate world, you'd have a nerd imagining a world where the United States continued on, and the only thing they'd have to go off of is revolutionary America. They would probably imagine a place that we would call stuck in time. Their alternate 2024 America might be a place where men in powdered wigs would go tally-ho and fire their muskets at the British. They might imagine a United States that would become a Jeffersonian dream, because that's what the founder wanted. They could never imagine that America would ever become a military superpower, or would have cities as big as New York or LA. You get my point?
Like,
my point is that...
I mean, that does make sense. I mean, we compare it with other realities that we do know. Because again, so many things changed between the founding of the United States and then what's going on now. We had the whole slavery issue. We're going to have the Industrial Revolution. We're going to have the Western expansion. There's going to be a lot of things, a lot of variables that I guess you wouldn't know yet. So
if X empire never fell,
I think that's a good
even
point
if it somehow continued on for hundreds or thousands of more years, it would not look like the empire we recognized at all.
That's fair.
A world without gunpowder, no printing press, no electricity, steam, or nukes. A world where a major scientific discovery just doesn't happen, or an invention is never invented. Cool. What now? While I can't help myself, and will do an Empire Never Falling video from time to time, I try to avoid the whole what if X was never invented thing. I'm older and wiser now. Because what happens in a world where something isn't invented? It just isn't invented. Like, for example, a world where electricity never exists. Yes, a scenario where there is just no electricity, it is not invented. Pretty much means the last century didn't happen. What would the 20th century be like without electricity? There just isn't the 20th century as we know it. Like, what do you even say about that? It's completely unrecognizable.
Could it be slower forms of growth, potentially, because we know it's a tree branch that brings in new technology. Something like electricity spawned a whole bunch of other new things that the modern world is reliant on.
What if we went back further? No printing press.
It'd be
the very
invented
way
later,
books are created and how information is spread is entirely stuck in the days of medieval scribes copying every last letter. How do you imagine that world? It's kind of like
maybe one where the Protestant Reformation doesn't happen the way it does. I think that's plausible.
Verse of the last section.
Or the
if an
scientific
empire
revolution
continued forever, it would be unrecognizable, and any era from the last 500 years without the printing press would be pretty unrecognizable as well. Now, while this sucks for realism, it does make for pretty good fiction. Steampunk worlds where steam power has become the main source of energy. Galactic empires that don't use computers but people instead.
More steam.
Or maybe
if there's no electricity, then it is literally steampunk world.
And just stick to the whole medieval knight thing in a world of gunpowder for some reason. You can make alterations where certain breakthroughs happen sooner or are delayed, but imagining a timeline where nobody, anywhere, at any time stumbles upon these achievements just doesn't really work. Like, to demonstrate this point, we have to look at a few different civilizations.
Well, the thing is, though, there are technologies we're going to say the same thing that don't exist right now. They're going to be, you know what I mean, that we don't use and we don't know either. It would just be on the path that we're whatever on.
Scattered across the globe, all arriving at similar discoveries. Like Newton and Leibniz discovered calculus independently. Same for Darwin and Wallace for the theory of evolution.
Printing press.
Carl Scheele identified oxygen first, but Joseph Priestley published his findings earlier. In the 1860s, a Russian and a German both discovered the periodic table. Simply removing an inventor from the equation doesn't remove the invention.
Well, yeah, but he was saying it would, in this hypothesis, it never happens. Not just Gutenberg didn't create that printing press. If you're just saying that, then yeah, like there's so many other alternate things that can happen that probably would happen, because so many things are just almost inevitable conclusions of humans' desires to be more productive.
Delays the inevitable. It's still fun to think about, though. Ultimately, all these scenarios are just fun to talk about. This whole video is about nitpicking. Don't take it too seriously. Please be nice.
Is Cody getting sick of alternate history?
Once again, if you want to help the channel,
I feel like he's starting to get sick of all this crap. Final thoughts. Yeah, I guess Cody he's just getting sick of this stuff. He's like, gosh, guys, alternate history is actually just really dumb. Let's move on to something more productive. But they are interesting, and it is actually important, though, because history is all about causes and effects. And I think one of the biggest things we can all understand is, and I guess debate in a way, though, is the impact of certain events in history, had they been done differently or not at all or done earlier, would absolutely have massive effects on the way that things develop. The world that we know it is a product of the causes that we have seen, and that's the only way we can even process this. It is important to teach cause and effects. Everything has a reaction. Everything has an influence in history, and there are certain moments that we can look at that really helps us tell our history and see where we came from. And there are those events for sure. Anyway, okay. Always fun to look at alternate history hub stuff. And with that, we'll see y'all next time.